If you read the Old Testament, you're going to find that there are many passages that indicate that God was performing miracles to the Jewish people. And oftentimes these took place in the Jewish temple. The Jewish temple was a very special place. The first temple was built by King Solomon, and that lasted until 586 BC when it was overturned by King Nebuchadnezzar under the Babylonian kingdom. And then again, it was reconstructed under King Cyrus of the Medo-Persian kingdom starting around 535 BC, and that was completed in 516 BC. And that temple lasted until 70 AD when the Romans destroyed it in Jerusalem. They destroyed all of it. And Jesus had portended much of this. So in Matthew 24, 1-2, it says, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly, I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now let's notice, Jesus said this again, probably around somewhere between the year 30 and 33. We have evidence from geology, which I'm going to point to in this video, about earthquakes that occurred around the year 33. We also have evidence from many scholars about Jesus' crucifixion taking place on April 3rd of the year 33. And so starting in the year 30, there were some miracles that were going in the temple, and also some things that weren't happening in the temple that were giving some Jewish people, especially the scholars, lots of concern. And so we're going to talk today about what the Talmud says, the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud. We will also talk about what Josephus said in the first century and some other little signs that were coming from God that something big was going on. Jesus started his ministry around the year 30 AD, and coincidentally, some of the events that I'm about to tell you started around that same time. So here we go. In Luke 21, 5-9, it says, and while some were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, he said, as for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And they asked him, Teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And he said, see that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-apologist.com, where truth matters. So if you like this kind of content, please like, subscribe, and don't forget to share this with your friends. Let's go. Here's what Robert Plummer says, and this is in a 2005 journal article in Jets. He said that there was a light, eastern or western, that remained lit. That was signifying God's presence. 1 Samuel 3:3, you can go back for a cross-reference. And then there was a thread in the temple that for many, many years was changing from crimson to white. So they had this sign of this thread that would change on the Day of Atonement. And it was signifying Isaiah 1:18. Though your sins are like scarlet, they will be as white as snow. Though they are like red, like crimson, they will be like wool. Lots were cast on the Day of Atonement for the scapegoat or the Lord. For hundreds of years, lots for the Lord always came up in the right hand, indicating God's favor. However, starting in 30 AD, the lots came up in the left hand. That is a cross reference to Leviticus 16:8. Also, what started to occur was massive, heavy temple doors were opening on their own, which was indicating that perhaps God is leaving the temple. You know, there was the very sacred holy space in the temple, and it was where the Holy of Holies was. The priest went in there once a year, and it was a very dangerous situation because if he did things improperly, he could die. And so he would tie a rope to himself in case he needed to be pulled out by others if he died while in there making atonement for the Jewish people. So here we go. In the Babylonian Talmud, Yoma 4:1, it says, our rabbis have taught on Tanaite authority. 40 years before the destruction of the sanctuary, the lot did not come up in the right hand, and the thread of crimson never turned white, and the westernmost light never shone, and the doors of the courtyard would open by themselves. Okay, so we've got what was going on. Here's what the Jerusalem Talmud also confirms, Yoma 6:3, and this was around, these Talmud books were after Jesus walked the earth. This one was around 5th century AD. It was stated 40 years before the temple was destroyed, was the eastern, or western in other translations, light extinguished, and the shiny strip became red, and the lot of the name came up in the left hand. They were locking the doors of the temple hall in the evening, and in the morning they found them open. Rabban Johanan ben Zakkai addressed it. Temple hall, why do you frighten us? We know that in the end you will be destroyed, as it was said, Lebanon, open your doors, so fire may consume your cedars. That's a reference to Zechariah 11:1. Matthew 27:50-54, and you can compare these passages to Mark 15:33 and Luke 23:44-45. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. This is at the crucifixion on the Friday, the Passover, probably April 3rd of the year 33. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion, and that's Longinus, tradition says his name was Longinus, and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Now, tradition says that unfortunately Longinus was martyred due to this statement. He was the one who had pierced Jesus' side, but he was martyred for becoming a Christian. The curtain was replaced each year at Yom Kippur, the curtain of the temple. So it was a very special curtain. Again, that's where the Holy of Holies resided. Here's an image, if you can see this, of what the temple would have looked like. You can, of course, see some of the many important symbols of the temple. It signified, according to Josephus, the universe. It was very central to Jewish life, and people went to the temple at Passover and worshiped God. Okay, here's another image, again, of where the Holy of Holies would be, in the temple, the curtain, that sort of thing. Here's what modern scholarship says about the earthquakes that were reported in the Gospel of Matthew. Scholars have reported that devastating earthquakes occurred in Jerusalem during Christ's death. Reference Mallet, 1853, and Rigg, 1941. This occurred in a region that includes the Dead Sea Fault, which is a plate boundary that separates the Arabian Plate and the Sinai subplate, according to Garfunkel, 1981. This fault has been active since the Miocene, according to Kagan, Stein, Agnon, and Newman, 2011, and the fault is still active today, according to Deliso and Fedani, 2014. The fault extends from the Red Sea in the south to the Taurus Mountains in the north. Kagan and colleagues analyzed seismites in the Holocene Dead Sea Basin by constructing two age-depth chronological models based on atmospheric radiocarbon ages of short-lived organic debris with a Bayesian model. Seismites are sedimentary beds and structures which are deformed by seismic shaking. The scholars analyzed seismites in different areas of the basin, finding that several synchronous seismites appeared in all sections during particular years, including 33 AD, plus or minus 2 sigma 95% confidence interval. Other years in which earthquakes occurred in the same area, as evidenced by seismites, are, and this is in the year AD unless otherwise noted, 1927, 1293, 1202, 1212, 749, 551, 419, 33, and then prior to that, 31 BC, and in the mid-century BC. So you see, it's very rare that this occurs. After analyzing laminated sedimentary cores recovered at the shores of the Dead Sea, Migowski, Agnon, Bookman, Ngendenk, and Stein in 2004 also confirmed an earthquake in 33 AD with a magnitude of 5.5. They documented earthquakes around 33 AD in 31 BC and 76 AD. The scholars analyzed seismites using radiocarbon dating. Okay. So here's what we also see. Ben Menahem in 2014 conducted a literature review of empirical studies over 4,000 years of seismicity along the Dead Sea Rift. The scholar referenced the aforementioned studies along with one by Enzel, Kaden, and El in 2000 before concluding that earthquakes occurred in Masada in 31 BC, Jerusalem in 33 AD, and near Nablus in 64 AD. So when was Jesus crucified? The Bible indicates that Jesus was crucified on Friday, the day of preparation, which some scholars have determined is Nisan 14, and the reference there is Humphreys and Waddington, 1985. During this time period in which Pontius Pilate served as governor, the only two possibilities in which Nisan 14 fell on a Friday occurred on April 7th in 30 AD and April 3rd in 33 AD. To determine when Nisan 14 fell on a Friday, Humphreys and Waddington reconstructed the first century Jewish calendar using astronomical calculations. To determine which date is appropriate, we refer to John 2:20. They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. Assuming this refers to the inner temple, according to Hayner, 1977, the date in which the Jews made this statement would be between 30 and 31 AD. If the only Passovers that occurred during Jesus' ministry are the three to which John referred in his gospel, the 33 AD date suggests a ministry of about 2.5 years, according to Humphreys and Waddington. They determined 33 is the most appropriate date, and I agree with them. But do we have evidence that of what the atheists will call the zombie apocalypse from anyone else besides Matthew? Well, we sure do. St. Ignatius of Antioch, he was martyred probably around 107. He was a companion. He knew John, the Apostle John, very well. And he also knew the other people who were the saints, the bishops, other people involved in the Roman Catholic Church. Here's what he says. For says the scripture, many bodies of the saints that slept arose, their graves being opened. He descended indeed into Hades alone, but he arose accompanied by a multitude and rent asunder that means of separation which had existed from the beginning of the world, and cast down its partition wall. He also rose again in 3 days, the Father raising him up. And after spending 40 days with the apostles, he was received up to the Father and sat down at his right hand, expecting till his enemies are placed under his feet. On the day of the preparation, then, at the 3rd hour, he received the sentence from Pilate, the Father permitting that to happen. At the 6th hour, he was crucified. At the 9th hour, he gave up the ghost. And before sunset, he was buried. During the Sabbath, he continued under the earth in the tomb in which Joseph of Arimathea had laid him. At the dawning of the Lord's day, he rose from the dead, according to what was spoken by himself. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man also be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The day of the preparation, then, comprises the passion. The Sabbath embraces the burial. The Lord's day contains the resurrection. Incidentally, you notice this part about him going into the earth. Now, I've been trying to figure out exactly whether there is a location for hell and for purgatory. And what I've found from numerous saints and people who seem to have some insights is that yes, the center of the earth is hell. So that's part of it. And purgatory has many different levels. The closest levels to hell are when the people had, they definitely had a repentance in mind, but they had much to do, many prayers to say, and many prayers to receive, hopefully, in that case. To anyone who goes into purgatory, it's believed that they will go to heaven. They're just being purged of their sins, cleansed of their sins, it's reported. Okay, so here's what Josephus in Wars of the Jews, book 6, chapter 5 said. We're reporting now some of the events that took place. Josephus was born in 37 AD, and he was reporting a lot of stuff that occurred around the destruction of the second temple and just prior to it. Here's what he said. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident and did so plainly foretell their future desolation, but, like men infatuated without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword, which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of the unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month Xanthicus, or Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone round the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. Okay, so this again is reporting on the temple. At the same festival also, a heifer, in other words, for a cow, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Imagine that. So the idea was the high priest always had to sacrifice a heifer. It was, again, something that was in atonement for the sins of the Jewish people. This was done once a year. And instead of giving birth to a small cow, a baby cow, instead of doing that, or a calf, instead we have the birth of a lamb. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was there made of one entire stone, was seen to be opened of its own accord, about the 6th hour of the night. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon running to the captain of the temple, and told him of it, who then came up thither, and not without great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. Again, a little scary stuff going on here in the 1st century. Here's an image of what the temple would have looked like before it had been destroyed. So you can see it's a gigantic building. And here's what Joseph also said. This also appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God did thereby open them the gates of happiness. But the men of learning understood it, that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord, and that the gate was opened for the advantage of their enemies. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month, Artemisius, or Jeer, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable were it not related by those that saw it. Again, remember, Josephus is contemporary to this time. And were not the events that followed of it so considerable in nature as to deserve such signals? For, before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. In other words, a very spiritual battle was taking place, and this is evidence. And so it says, moreover, this again from Wars of the Jews, at that feast, which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was to perform their sacred ministrations, they said that in the first place they felt a quaking and heard a great noise. And after that they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, let us remove hence. But what is still more terrible, there was one Jesus, not the same Jesus as Jesus Christ. This one was the son of Ananus, a plebeian and a husbandman, who 4 years before the war began, at a time when the city was in very great peace and prosperity, came to that feast, whereupon is it our custom for every one to make tabernacles to God in the temple, began on a sudden to cry aloud, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, and a voice against this whole people. This was his cry as he went about day and by night in all the lanes of the city. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, and took up the man and gave him a great number of severe stripes. Yet did not he either say anything for himself or anything peculiar to those that chastised him, but still went on with the same words which he cried before. Hereupon our rulers, supposing it the case proved to be that this was a sort of divine fury in the man, brought him to the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. Yet he did not make any supplication for himself, nor shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible, at every stroke of the whip, his answer was, woe, woe to Jerusalem. And here is what the image looks like, the fall of the Second Temple. You can see that they had looted, plundered the Second Temple. It was completely leveled and destroyed. And of course, as I had mentioned at the outset, Jesus had portended this event was going to occur. Thank you so much. I hope you like this kind of content. If you do, please do subscribe. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all in God's glory. Thank you. Bye-bye.